I am going to talk today about reimagining resilience to hate and what that really means, and how my own lived experience, and I don't refer to what we had survived in Bosnia as the Bosnian War. I refer to it as the Bosnian genocide. While legally it was established the genocide was committed in Srebrenica, which is one of the one of the 6 towns that were proclaimed safe areas, the rest of Bosnia suffered very much similar persecution, mass killings, concentration camps, rape camps. And I'm not sure that the legal systems internationally, or certainly domestically in Bosnia, will ever account for all of the atrocities. But those of us who survived it, we know what we had lived through. So I just wanted to clarify, when I talk about Bosnian genocide, I refer to the atrocities against Bosnian Muslims, Bosniaks across the entire country. And so as I start, I want to actually read a section from The Cat I Never Named, share this particular scene with all of you. It's a moment when I found myself crossing the main bridge in my hometown of Bihać, because I learned that the school would be back in session. And I was a total nerd. As a math and physics nerd, I'm very proud to say that. And I was excited because our schools were targeted. When genocide happens, the target is not only human beings. That's not the only target. It is destruction of the entire group of people, in part or in whole. And that also involves destroying libraries, destroying hospitals, destroying schools. So we couldn't go to our actual building school because they were targeted. And so through word of mouth, we were told that we would reconvene again and learn in a different space. And I wanted to tell a friend of mine, one of my closest friends, that the school is back in session. And then something happens on this main bridge in my hometown that changes me forever. Then I hear a whistling overhead, a thin, reedy sound. An instant later, I see a flash as a missile hits a house on the bank of the Una, on my home side of the bridge. The sound of the explosion comes an instant later, and I stand frozen, bizarrely thinking about physics, about the relative speed of light and sound that cleaves the experience in two. First, the sight of fire and flame, then disconnected by a second or two, sound waves that roll over me like messengers eager to bear bad news. I hear another missile overhead, launched from the mountains surrounding our town. Someone told Tata, who told me in turn, the bomb that you hear is not the one with your name on it. If you hear it whistle, it is because it is flying over your head to somewhere else. You never hear a whisper from the bomb that kills you. The air raid siren starts its high-pitched howl then. We have no radar, nothing to tell us that the missiles are inbound, so the siren is a joke. It just serves to remind us that people are being killed. It gives no warning, just wails and mourns with the rest of us. Davor and I find each other again. We're still frozen in place, not knowing if we're about to die. But our eyes meet across the bridge. Between us, I see the mother and her little boy, the girl in the green sweater, a trio of middle-aged women who look like sisters. Davor takes a step toward me. Then the air seems to be sucked out of the world as I'm hit with an earth-shattering, deafening explosion. There's a flash between Davor and me, and I'm blinded. Metal and stone are flying around me. I turn to run, and it's only when my legs are moving that I realize I'm not dead. I only make it a few steps before I fall, scraping my knees. In the dust and chaos, I hear screams. and I drag myself to my feet, stunned. My ears are ringing, and the air is choked with dust. I smell smoke. I taste smoke. There's grit on my tongue. The blue bridge is still standing. The bomb struck a glancing blow that didn't do anything much to the structure, but the pedestrians on the bridge. Against every survival instinct, I make myself walk back towards the other end of the bridge. I look all around, but don't see Davor. The little boy, the one who wanted to look at fish over the side of the bridge, is standing in the middle of a cloud of masonry dust. His mouth is open, and at first I think the sound he's making is part of the loud ringing in my ears, because everything sounds weirdly muffled at first. The sounds are returning to my ears one at a time. Then I realize he's screaming a long, drawn-out, terrible cry that stops only when he's out of breath, then starts again after a ragged gasp. I go to him. He's blonde, tussle-haired, and blue-eyed, just like Dino when he was younger. But his little face looks impossibly old. I wish he could be confused. I wish he didn't know exactly what just happened. But this little boy understands his loss, and he's suffused with helpless, inarticulate rage. I go to him. Reaching out my hand, he just stares at me with his prematurely aged face. I look beyond him. Blood on a stylish suit, the fox fur collar, made from a whole fox, its sharp white teeth grinning as it grasps its own tail. Its black glass eyes are staring at me. Above that, nothing. There's nothing where his mother's head should be. He finds words now. And his screams turn into a desperate wail for his mother. He's not looking at her, but he must have seen. He's calling to her like his words could turn back time, undo the bomb. Like if he begs the universe loudly enough, he can make his mother alive again. I take his little hand, and he looks at me like I'm an alien thing. I try to lead him off the bridge, but he's like a boulder, immovable. All this time, he never stops screaming his feral fury against the world. An old man staggers beside us. A couple clings to each other as they walk through the smoke. Though it is midday, the smoke and dust make it look like a foggy evening. Survivors are like ghosts in the haze. I still don't see Davor, not among the bodies or the survivors. The little boy's grief shatters me. There is nothing I can do. So I leave him. It's a wrenching decision, but someone will come to help him. I look at the other people on the bridge. The three middle-aged sisters are strewn about like old clothes. That's what I see. Their old lady sweaters and their sensible shoes. A man is hanging half of the bridge draped over the rail. Blood is dripping in a puddle at his feet. Then I see the girl in the green sweater like mine. She's on the ground, curled on her side, facing away from me. Her sweater is perfectly clean and tidy, like she just decided to take a nap in this odd place. I think she's unconscious. Maybe she was knocked out by the shock wave. I kneel at her side and take her shoulder, gently turning her over as I say, "Don't worry, I'm here. I'll help you." I roll her and find a bloody horror. The front of her body stripped of clothes, stripped of skin, shredded from a hail of metal and stone sharpening. From the front, she doesn't look human. She looks like meat. I scream and scramble backward on my hands and feet like a crab, wiping my bloody hands on the ground. They make a red paste with the dust. I roll to my knees, hold myself to my feet, look around for somebody, anybody who can do something. Suddenly, there are lights up ahead in the middle of the road where we're walking. It's a big, square, white lorry with tall blue letters on the side. UN. The United Nations is supposed to be here to help the suffering, to facilitate peace. With a gasp of relief, I run to meet the truck, waving my hand to stop them. Help is here. I shout to the little boy as I pass him, these men will help you. I'm standing in the middle of the road, right in the truck's path. It slows. The driver sees me. He meets my eye. Please have medics, I think. Please have some kind counselor who can take care of this poor child. Please have someone to compassionately tend to that poor girl's body, to cover her ravaged face. But the UN truck swerves around me, increasing speed. Okay, I think. They're going to the wounded in the center of the bridge. But the truck doesn't stop. It drives fast enough to make the damaged bridge shake. It swerves carefully around the carnage and rubble and carries on as if dead Bosnians weren't sprawled on the streets. The world is watching, and it doesn't care. Thank you. So I have read this hundreds of times. This book was published 4 years ago. I've been in many schools, in many classrooms around the world. It never gets easier for me. I relive it each and every time. But I do it for a purpose, for a reason, to connect with you emotionally. Here I am coming as a professor from Columbia. What do I have to say on this? Especially when people don't know my background. This gives you a piece of me, piece of my experience, what has made me, what has inspired me to do what I do. What do you think my thoughts were at that moment, at that time? I thought that I was a human being until I wasn't. And those institutions, those people that I thought would see me as a human being, didn't. They left us behind. In the field of education, in educational theory, in learning theories that I study, we study how is it that we actually learn and transform? How do we change as people? How do we change our perspective on any kind of issue? And so I'm very interested in these kinds of learning transformations that we might go through in life. And so this kind of scene reflects a type of experience. And it doesn't always have to be that you have to go through something as extreme as I just shared with you, but it could be some other disruption in your life, some other shock, losing a job, losing a spouse, losing a loved one, that triggers a process of self-reflection that ultimately leads us to transform our behaviors, our beliefs, our worldview. My worldview changed. I believed in these institutions, and I stopped believing in them at that time. And I had to rebuild myself, rebuild that new identity of who Amra is now. What does Amra now believe in, and how should I behave? Should I respond to targeted violence with targeted violence? Should I take violence as a means to kind of seek revenge in response to what I had experienced? I think my bio and what I do today in life demonstrates that I chose a nonviolent path. I chose a path of educating about these kinds of experiences. But there are others who didn't and who don't all over the world because they've lost faith, the faith that was brought up in the world's institutions. And so in terms of a theory that sort of captures what I just shared with you, I work a lot within the transformative learning theory, which actually originated at Columbia University at the Graduate School of Education, where I'm a faculty member and researcher. And it originated with a colleague of mine who's no longer with us. His name is Jack Meserov, who in essence studied people in these transformative moments in their lives to understand how we begin to transform our perspectives on various issues. And these kinds of scenes and moments and experiences, whether it is something that is happening today around the world and what we are observing in Palestine and Israel has been brought up as an example, but these kinds of experiences in Bosnian genocide as well can impact people across generations. And not only those who are survivors or children of survivors, but also groups that referentially connect to those issues. I'm sure you've seen in the news that higher education institutions are experiencing a moment in the United States where thousands of students are protesting, including at my own institution, including some of my colleagues and some of my students who are advocating for human rights. And some of those views and perspectives are being challenged. So we are dealing with individual and social transformations, in fact, worldwide as we speak. So this process of self-reflection that we go through when we're transformed by shocks either to our own individual lives or our societies ultimately leads to a more complex sense of identity. And I often say that identity isn't a category. I think humans often want to categorize people. Where do you fit? Amra is 6 feet tall, she's a tall person. Oh, wait, she doesn't look like a Muslim. How could you be a Muslim? That's a question that I get all the time. People don't like complexity, stories. We don't want to pay attention to hear someone's lived experience. We don't approach them often with curiosity, but with preconceived notions of who they are and which category they belong into. So I try to challenge that every day in the work that I do as an educator. So one insight that I'll share with you is that lived experience is integral to understanding hate and the prevention of targeted violence. Not only is it integral that we share our lived experiences, but also that we receive the stories from others about their own experiences. And so because I am so interested in this question, why do people hate? And why genocides happen over and over again? Why ordinary people commit these extraordinarily painful and horrific acts of violence? I started to study people who radicalize across different ideologies. And so I'm not going to go into the entire theory and model, but we call it educational displacement theory or model of radicalization. So I had an assumption when I started to work with individuals who radicalized to understand their own experiences that they must be somehow bad. There must be something wrong with them because they're willing to commit an act of violence targeting a particular group. But then what I learned is that none of these individuals that I had studied, the lived experiences and stories, actually started their process of radicalization with the intent to harm someone else. It always started with a sense of invisibility, lack of voice, not having a sense of belonging in their community and often in their school, which is why the model is called educational displacement model of radicalization, meaning that when in our schools, in our universities, we fail to effectively create a sense of belonging for each and every person, irrespective of their background or lived experience, we are at the risk of educationally displacing our youth. And if you forget everything I said tonight, I hope you don't forget this image. So when I was thinking about educational displacement or a data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative data that we have been collecting over the years in different contexts, societies, geographies, and so on, when I started collecting data and observing that there is actually a problem of this sense of educational displacement that many groups and many individuals feel across different societies, I started to wonder, where's this sense of displacement coming from? And asking some of those questions. And what became apparent is that we're actually not looking at the question of violence in a way in a way that accounts for its full complexity. We often think of violence as a physical harm, killing a person. But actually, violence can also come in the form of cultural violence. And this is a term that was first used decades ago by sociologist Galtung, who is no longer with us. And he argued cultural violence is actually root cause to other forms of violence that target individuals for their identity, whether it's structural violence or direct violence that we might observe, whether it's in Bosnia or it's on an American street where a black person is killed simply because they're black. So cultural violence is actually stories of hate, hateful stories, narratives of supremacy, othering, marginalization, dehumanization, because only if we tell those stories about one another and create that othered, targeted group, can actually the acts of physical harm follow, can actually the policies of structural discrimination follow. Racial segregation was legal in the United States of America. How was it legal? Why was that acceptable? It's not right, but it was a norm. It was norm only because the stories that dehumanized a particular group of people were made possible through media, through education, through history, and so on. So if you forget everything else, I hope you don't forget that stories matter, words matter, and how we speak of one another matters, because that is what fuels genocides through history over and over again. Here's another visual way of representing this. So cultural violence ultimately has this impact of educational displacement. And sometimes people say to me, for instance, educators in the United States will say to me, oh, my students are privileged, we are a wealthy school, it's an all-girls school, and we don't have a problem with hate, so we don't need to worry about those kinds of issues and questions. Well, the entire society is impacted adversely when any one group of people is targeted for who they are. And so I study those who are educationally displaced. I was educationally displaced, and those of you who are perhaps of my generation remember growing up in former Yugoslavia. If you have Bosniak identity, I didn't read the stories about Amras that were positive. I read stories about Amras as a negative character throughout the history that I was taught. So I knew very early on, from second grade that I can remember, first time, that somehow I was talked about in our curricula as lesser, that I was seen in my own society as lesser. So the groups that are educationally displaced are adversely impacted, but also those who are educational displacers, meaning those who perpetuate narratives of hate are actually also negatively and across generations impacted by the violence that they might promote. And lastly, those of us who might be bystanders who think it doesn't impact me. But I'll show you a couple of slides that actually connect violence that transpired in Bosnia in the 1990s and how it inspires different forms of hate today across the Western world in particular. So I already shared these insights just to summarize them for you. People don't radicalize based on facile desire to hurt others, but through a much more nuanced process. It always begins with a sense of being invisible and the sense that their grievances, whether they're real or perceived, they're real to them, are not effectively addressed. And then educational displacement doesn't necessarily mean that students will drop out of school. I can be the top of my class and still feel educationally displaced if I don't feel that my peers and my educators respect me for who I am. How do we address this? I believe in the idea of building school and societal belonging. And I'm not going to go too much into math behind this chart, but I'm going to share this with you. This is, and at the end, I'll share a slide with you where if you want to take a photo and you you want to read, and we can share these slides with you as well. If you want to read any of these studies, you're most welcome to do that. But especially in the last several months, there has been challenge to the notion of freedom, academic freedom and freedom of expression in the United States. And all of these protests, whether we agree with protesters or disagree with them, is a relevant point. But they're protesting because they don't feel seen and heard. Their grievances are not, whether real or perceived, are not being effectively addressed. So I decided with my research team at Columbia to look at 68 countries, more than 500,000 student surveys, to understand what factors, risk factors, protective factors, predict school belonging. And I'll just tell you the main finding. What we found is that when we provide access to freedom of speech and expression of one's grievances in educational environments, that increases a sense of belonging. And if we have a greater sense of belonging in our schools, that means that we're less likely to engage in any kind of violence against one another. And we also specifically looked at different immigrant backgrounds, first generation, second generation, or what we call third generation plus native students. And we found that the effect is particularly strong for second generation immigrants, meaning that if second generation immigrants in a particular society experience a sense of belonging in their schooling spaces, that sense of belonging often comes from this idea that they feel seen, that they can express their grievances, they have freedom of expression. Why do you think the effect is strongest for second-generation immigrants? Why not first-generation immigrants? Or why not students who've been, let's say, in Belgium for 3 generations and more? And so first generation might not even know that I have spaces or I can express myself or my grievances or my frustrations and so on. But the second generation has the understanding perhaps of where they had come from as immigrants and what it took to come to their new homeland, but also has now understanding of this new system and the mechanisms that hopefully exist for them to express their grievances. And if they feel that their access is equal to those mechanisms of free expression as compared to everyone else in the society, they will actually feel a sense of belonging. So when I speak with entities like federal government in the United States, or today I was in Brussels at another conference talking about prevention of terrorism and extremism, I talked about belonging. If you build belonging and allow free expression, we will have much less problems than we do have now in many societies across different groups of people. The question of why the storytelling matters is an important one for me, but I also wanted to share with you some data that we collected in the United States in the last few years. We surveyed students across 40 states and asked them, what are your experiences like when somebody targets you for your identity? Can teachers actually, are they trained well? Can they address it? Do they stay silent in response to it? Or do they actually address the issue through dialogue? And only 7% agreed that all educators in their school can handle incidents of bias. That is a very concerning statistic, given how diverse certainly the United States is. Then we asked them about their exposure to different types of information. And 15% agreed that they learn what they want in school and don't need to search for other sources of information outside school. So in the US, there's this big political debate on should we ban this book, ban that book, ban this conversation, ban that conversation. But what students are telling us, if I don't get to have a conversation I want to have in the classroom, I'll find another place where to have it. And so we often tell educators, we tell parents, policymakers, the choice you are making between disallowing a conversation on difficult topic in the classroom or allowing it is actually a choice between keeping student engaged in the school or sending the student to engage online with who knows what kinds of sources of information. Here's another another insight I wanted to share with you. So over the years, as you know, a lot of work has been done to address hate, to address extremism, radicalization. What often happens in a lot of literature is that particular groups end up being profiled as more prone to terrorism, as more prone to extremism, and so on. So we decided to look at the background of different individuals we were surveying and try to see, does my identity as belonging to X or Y or Z ethnicity or race predict lesser integration or belonging in my environment? So what we found in the US is that whether I'm white, Middle Eastern, Black, or African American or Asian, irrespective of my racial background, that background in itself, that identity in itself, does not predict the lack of belonging. And some people said, oh, we're not really so sure that that's the case. Is that possible? But there's another important piece of information here to give you a full picture. When we looked at the relationship between students' sense of belonging and their experiences of harmful, hurtful, biased behaviors targeting their identity, we found that it is that experience of discrimination that actually adversely impacts belonging. In other words, Amra, who is an American Muslim, and let's assume is 10 years old now in a public school in New York, is not more or less likely than anybody else to have a sense of belonging in school simply because she's an American Muslim. But if Amra is made fun of as an American Muslim, as a Muslim, in her school environment, either by educators or peers, she's more likely to feel a lesser sense of belonging. So it's really important for us to know that identity matters, particularly in relation to how that identity might be treated in educational spaces. I want to now give you an example of how Bosnian genocide relates to the violence we witness today across the world. I don't know to what extent you're familiar with some of the mass shootings in the United States. We experience them very often, unfortunately. In 2022, there was a young man who killed 10 people simply because they're Black in Buffalo, New York. And I was actually scheduled, coincidentally, to train on hate prevention educators in Buffalo, New York, the day after the shooting. And all the educators showed up. There was a lot of tears and emotions, but they all showed up. And they said, we actually need these kinds of trainings. Well, he was inspired by the attack in the Christchurch in New Zealand. In 2019, in El Paso, Texas, another 21-year-old killed 23 people. He targeted them for their Latinx background. But he was also inspired by the Christchurch shooter and specifically anti-Muslim hate in New Zealand. So who was the Christchurch shooter in New Zealand? He was a man who took 51 lives in 2 mosques. He was the first person to live stream mass shooting and inspired many other mass shooters after that to live stream the mass killings. Many don't know that in the background he played a song, Serbia Strong, and that song celebrates Bosnian genocide, including mentioning specific towns and cities, and my own hometown of Bihać. Adam Lanza was a young man who in 2012 committed a mass shooting, killed mostly 6- and 7-year-olds in 2012. He was inspired by Anders Breivik's attack in Norway. Who was Anders Breivik? He murdered 77 people. He was inspired by Serb extremists, specifically declared that Radovan Karadzic, during his court proceedings, who was a Serb leader, who now serves a life sentence for committing genocide and mass atrocities in Bosnia, that he was inspired by Karadzic as a new and respected leader, and Karadzic has become an icon of the far right. And so this just gives you an example of how something that happened to some of us a few decades ago in a small country that doesn't seem relevant to much of the rest of the world, actually, even today, inspires hate and hate-fueled violence that impacts all of us. So hate is omnipresent. It's not exclusive to any one group of people, country, or culture. Acts of targeted violence are worldwide and cross-national phenomena. So how do I work on addressing these? I'm just going to quickly, as we end and open it to questions, share here that we do a lot of trainings, some funded by the federal government in the United States or other organizations, through the International Interfaith Research Lab that I run at Columbia. We train educators, we train students, and we use storytelling as a powerful way to emotionally bring people into conversation. And this is just a page, if any of you want to actually read the studies that I had referenced, that you can take a photo of, or you can simply go to interfaithlab.com and look for those studies and explore them on your own time. So with that, I'm going to end my sort of lecture portion of the evening. Welcome your questions if we have time for questions. And this is just, you can use the QR code if you want to explore the projects that we do at Columbia. I'm happy to talk about them and how you can get in touch with me as well. Thank you.